Привit moi druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I am an American professor trying to help you understand what's going on in Ukraine. I'm trying to provide context and engage in sense making because it's very complicated. So if you like what I have to say, I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a like somewhere along the way. Whenever something strikes you and you're like, you know what, this is good stuff. Now, the other thing that I would ask you to do is if you're new, please consider subscribing. Today, what I want to talk about is Seymour Hersh. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, that's okay. He is an American journalist who has actually done some pretty important things in journalism, but he's not an everyday household name. Now, most recently, he's made the claim that Zelensky and some of Zelensky's friends have made $400 million off the United States government, just skimming money off the top. This is Seymour Hersh, and I'm going to go through a little bit about him and about his claims, and then I'll let you decide for yourself what's going on. He made his name first reporting about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and then he wrote a number of books. He very famously disputed the way that Osama bin Laden was killed. He was saying that Obama was covering things up, but he's been in journalism for a long time. Here's the article about him in Encyclopedia Britannica. So I'm just going to go over this. He made his name in My Lai massacre, Abu Ghraib prison. In 1969, he interviewed Army Lieutenant William Calley, who was the commanding officer in the My Lai massacre. He did some groundbreaking work with the Watergate scandal, and Woodward and Bernstein got most of the credit, but he was involved in that. Hersh characterized Bush's prosecution of the war, President George W. Bush's prosecution of the war, as the product of misguided neoconservative idealism. Now, this is right from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I'm showing you that for a reason, because we all have our biases, and his bias is that Bush's neoconservative idealism pushed him to war, and he's been pretty much against every war that he's seen, and he's fairly consistent with this. And he's also against U.S. support of Ukraine in this current war that Ukraine is fighting with Russia. In May 2015, Hersh made headlines again with his allegations published in a London Review of Books that cited Pakistani and anonymous U.S. sources that officials of the U.S. and Pakistani governments, including U.S. President Barack Obama, had lied regarding the details of the 2011 raid on the compound in Pakistan in which Osama bin Laden was killed. Hersh claimed that Pakistani intelligence had been holding Osama bin Laden prisoner since 2006, and Pakistani officials knew all about the raid before it happened. That being said, he has won a Pulitzer Prize, so he's a legitimate voice out there, but I'm making a claim that he's kind of biased. Now, here's what he wrote the other day. He wrote in this article on his own blog, Trading with the Enemy, and he said this: the Ukrainian president and many in his entourage have been skimming untold millions of dollars earmarked for diesel fuel payments. One estimate by analysts from Central Intelligence Agency, now anonymous source, he's not going to tell you who said that, and he's not going to cite his sources, put the embezzled funds at $400 million last year. It's also charged that they were paying $400 per gallon to transport gasoline from a port in Pakistan. There's another charge that he was buying diesel from the Russians. And then here at the end, the issue of corruption was directly raised with Zelensky in a meeting last January in Kyiv with CIA Director William Burns. His message to the Ukrainian president: I was told by an intelligence official, whom I shall not name, with direct knowledge of the meeting, was out of a 1950s mob movie. The senior generals and the government officials in Kyiv were angry at what they saw as Zelensky's greed. So Burns told the Ukrainian president because, quote, he was taking the larger share of the skim money than was going to the generals, unquote. Burns also presented Zelensky with a list of 35 generals and senior officials whose corruption was known to the CIA and others in the American government. Zelensky responded to the American pressure 10 days later by publicly dismissing 10 of the most ostentatious officials on the list and doing little else. The 10 he got rid of were brazenly bragging about the money that they had driving around Kyiv in their new Mercedes, the intelligence official told me. Okay, so this is where he's coming from. This is where Hersh's perspective is. Now, what's the ripple effect of this? Anybody can say anything on the internet. I'm saying something, he's saying something, but where's the truth lie? Now, I'm also making the claim that there is truth out there somewhere, and we're trying to figure out what it is. So those kind of claims get parroted on Twitter. Zelensky and team stole at least 400 million of Western aid, Seymour Hersh, or on RT. And here you see on RT, Zelensky and his team stole at least 400 million of U.S. aids, according to Seymour Hersh. And you see the whole article built around it, saying much of the same thing that he said in his blog. You'll see it here on the Jimmy Dore live show. If you're not familiar with Jimmy Dore, he is a very pro-Russian voice in as far as it goes with Ukraine.
So this might blow your mind. Not going to blow my mind. I've been saying this forever because Ukraine is the most corrupt nation in Europe. Now, they used to say this all the time in Western press, and this was from February 2015. Ukraine is the most corrupt nation in Europe. It's corrupt, but they're trying.
That's the official line of Ukraine I've heard over and over again.
While the conflict in Russia heats up in the east, life for most Ukrainians is marred by corruption, so endemic that the hospitals appear to be infected.
What?
Can anyone clean the country up? So this is from 2022. The most corrupt nation in Europe is earning millions every day due to the Ukraine war.
Now, what he's done there is switch from a 2015 article in the Guardians talking about corruption to something last year, TFI Global. I'm not familiar with it, but judging by the author's name, maybe it's in India or something along these lines. And this was in May after the invasion last year.
What? Hey, come on. Say something bad about Russia.
Okay, I'll say something bad about Russia. How about that? So he's going to go ahead and talk about that trading with the enemy article, and let's say something bad about Russia. Here's Transparency International. If you do look at this, Ukraine's not looking that great at 122. But where's Russia? On the Transparency International list, it's 136. It's more corrupt than Ukraine, but you would never know that talking to him. The U.S. is 27th or something. Yeah, 27th on the Transparency International list. So that's, be fair. If you're going to say that Ukraine is this corrupt, show the contrast with Russia since you're taking up for Russia. Okay, let's look at Twitter. You'll also see RT on Twitter saying this.
What do you make of these, these allegations of 400, it doesn't seem like a lot of money, but it's still a lot of money. These allegations that Zelensky could have stolen or I don't know, skimmed, if you like, off the top.
Well, it's like Claude Rains in Casablanca saying, "I'm shocked. There's gambling going on here." It's no shock at all. It's not surprising. We've known. I think it's an open secret that his government is corrupt, that he's corrupt, that he's been raking money off the top from the very beginning.
Now, this is a standard trope by those on that side of the spectrum trying to show that we shouldn't be involved in Ukraine and we shouldn't be fighting against Russia because they're all corrupt, and you hear it again and again.
Or Hersh did was really lay it out in a way that hasn't been seen before. The only problem is, will the Western media, the compliant media, actually pick up on it? I mean,
well, maybe not, because Hersh uses a lot of anonymous sources. This is why I show you in my videos Western sources, or I talk from Western sources, media sources that have journalistic integrity. Anybody can say anything. Now, here's another video of him talking about this. This is him talking about his perspective. Now, I should note that he's talking to CGTN, which is funded in whole or part by the Chinese government. That's who he's doing the interview with, and you'll see multiple parts of that interview. But here, he's talking about how he sees the world, and he's entitled to see the world the way that he sees the world.
By the way, running against Russia, being nasty to Russia is very popular. But I'll tell you what's not popular. More than 60% of the American people do not like all the money we're spending on Ukraine, and the American media is not reporting that, and it's also not reporting that there's demonstrations are going every weekend in Europe, particularly in Germany. There's a lot of demonstrations, not about the pipeline, against the war, the money that's being spent on Ukraine, and the whole notion of that war, and the whole rationale for the war. And you could almost understand why Biden wanted to keep Germany from having the option to open the pipeline,
Okay, so he's also made his name for claiming that the U.S. was behind the pipeline bombing as well, or the pipeline sabotage. Here he is again talking about U.S. foreign policy.
They have called also part of the called this planning stupidity, and you on several occasions you laughed at the intelligence level of the Biden administration.
I'm just not questioning their intelligence. These are all people. Tony Blinken and the Secretary of State, the one who didn't go to China because to meet his counterpart because of a balloon,
Yeah,
and Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, all have high degrees,
right.
and the Undersecretary of State, plenty of intelligence. It's just what they're so driven by, I think, hatred of all things, particularly Putin, and also communism per se. They're so cold warriors.
Okay, and that's fair if that's his assessment. But what I notice in people like Hersh and what I notice in people like Scott Ritter, and I was going to talk about this in another video, and maybe I still will, is that they tend to have a chip on their shoulder, the I know far better than you kind of syndrome. You see that in Colonel McGregor and others. But he has had this position for many, many years about seeing problems within the U.S. government particularly. And it's kind of like The Economist that called 14 of the last 3 recessions. If you see them everywhere, maybe you're kind of missing. How reliable are you? Anyway, I'll let him continue talking.
Really out of sorts. And it makes him do dumb things. I just think his foreign policy is complete idiocy, alienating a lot of people around the world. This notion of American hegemony, if you will, it just doesn't work anymore.
Okay, American hegemony is something that you see brought up in RT again and again and again and again. It's not something that we in the West tend to talk about, right? But the multipolar world and American hegemony are talking points for Putin. And he's singing this to an audience that's fairly similarly aligned in China.
And so that's what I object to.
Okay, and he's allowed to object to it, but I'm trying to give you his perception or his point of view, accurately his point of view, before we move on. Now here he is again, and I actually want to object to something that he has to say here, and I'll explain why.
The White House had arranged with Zelensky to have the air raid sirens gone. I would have said, why did they suddenly come in daytime? First time in 10 days and that time since. Why, did you really think the Russians would have made a move of trying to kill the President of the United States?
Okay, so one of the things that you see, and we all fall prey to this, is you tend to see the world in terms of patterns. And so he is arguing that the air raids going on while Biden was in Kyiv was a fix. It was set up to somehow make it look worse than it was, because of course the Russians aren't going to do that. And the Russians knew that Biden was there and knew where he was. They were warned, but it was a big show is what he's saying. I don't remember where it was. I want to say it was maybe Anna from Ukraine or somebody I was watching was talking about, look, when the air raids go off, it actually goes off countrywide. And the reason that it goes off countrywide, missiles are being fired from a long way away. We don't know exactly where it's going to be. And, so we're just giving people an alert. And I think that's a fair explanation of the thing. But he's seeing, he's calling a recession where it may or may not be a recession, like that economist calling 14 of the last 3 recessions.
With an air raid? The answer to that is clearly no. I mean, clearly not. And he's not interested in a nuclear exchange.
Okay, so I believe that this is a smart guy, just like he believes that the Biden administration are smart people. But I also believe he's fairly biased. Okay, let me go on and look at this. So when you have somebody like that, they will propagate these kind of nonsense. Now, this one is not from what he had to say, although there are articles upon articles upon articles. Let's go back to the first page that I was on here, where the top stories are about him fueling from the 400 million and widespread corruption and 400 million and 400 million. Those are all fueled from his blog. So There were other articles some time ago. This is April 5th, 2023. Fact check. No proof to back claims that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's assets and income. Why? Because people were saying, oh, well, he's got a Cayman account, or he's got real estate in Florida, and he's just padding his own pockets. Or there was another one here. Money Magazine called Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky the king of Western corruption. And see, we even had this cover from Money Magazine. That was Photoshop. No Money Magazine cover showing Zelensky actually existed. It was doctored, and it says so much here in the fact check. So, but people will believe it. People will believe what they want to believe. Now, this is why this is important. Hersh has used anonymous sources for a long time. That's been his bread and butter. This is from Wikipedia. Hersh's reporting is well known for its use of anonymous sources, which his biographer Robert Muradi described as his trademark. While working as a Pentagon correspondent for the AP, he developed many anonymous top and mid-level military sources, including Pentagon officials, to deride the fact that he, quote, broke every rule of bureaucratic journalism. Yeah, so he was using these anonymous sources. He wrote a book about Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, in his response to Hersh's 1983 book, The Price of Power, accused him of including, quote, inference plied upon assumption, third-hand hearsay accepted as fact, the self-serving accounts of disgruntled adversaries elevated the gospel, the impressions of people several times removed from the scene. Now, when you do that kind of thing, you get into trouble, because that you're creating a vision of how things are, but it may or may not be true. But in his world, it probably, I believe that he believes this, even though I don't believe that it's necessarily true. And the reason is, and this I got from, it's a great line from a book called Images of Organizations. It's about business management kind of stuff, organizational leadership, that kind of thing. And Garth Moran said, a way of seeing is a way of not seeing. That is, when you see things through one framework, it also crowds out other pieces that you could factor in. And that's the problem here with Hersh, but it's also a problem with us. So while I don't see the evidence because of everything else that I line up, I have to take this and I have to track it down and keep pursuing it to make sure that it's not actually what he says it is. Now, I don't believe it is what he says it is, but my proclivity is to disbelieve it. So that means that I have to go the extra mile to prove that it's not true. Okay, and while I'm at that, I've been working at this. Some people can say, hey, who are you to be saying these things about him? Well, you could just say anything just like he can. Yes, since day 85, I've been doing these videos about what's going on in Ukraine. And I have proven, I've shown you the videos, the resources, I've talked about the articles, I've pinned them, I've done all these things. So I welcome you to look back at my videos, challenge me. If you have a problem with what I have to say here, leave a comment below. I'm happy to talk about it. I want to talk about it. I want to help you see more clearly what's going on in Ukraine. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes that I hope you've given. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for the coffees. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.